Good morning, and welcome to today's topic, which is all about containers and planters and how we will work with them and integrate them into our landscapes. My name is Marianne Simon, a longtime landscape designer, earth activist, and I actually started my landscape business working with containers. So it's kind of fun to be coming full circle and talking about this topic with you today. Now, for those of you that have been with us before, you will recognize the puzzle as the way that we navigate our classes. The puzzle serves as a way to remind us that everything has a greater context. So no matter what it is that we're doing in the landscape, actually anywhere, there is always some sort of impact, some sort of consequence, both good and bad, to the actions that we take. So as we make our way through today's topic, the 6 pieces of the puzzle start out with number 1, which is why planters to begin with. Why are we not just putting our plants right into the ground? Number 2, soil. So again, soil is absolutely critical to anything that you want to grow. And when it comes to working with planters or containers, there are actually some things you need to think about that make it a little bit different than working with a native material. Number 3, water and drainage. So always important in the landscape, especially important when you're working with a contained space. What happens to that water? How do you keep it moving through? Number 4 is if you are interested in building your own planter and what would be involved with that. Number 5, this is maybe my favorite piece of the presentation, and that is container options. Really, the sky is the limit with what is possible. And then number 6 is plants, because not all plants like to be in that kind of a contained space. Others do really, really well. So just giving you some ideas for what you might be able to put into those planters. Now, there's all kinds of different options. When we are outdoors and we're looking at planters that are made of wood, there's basically 2 different kinds. You're probably familiar with a lot of this already. You've got sort of low planters where all we're doing is containing the space, compared to planters that are, maybe greater than 12 or 14 inches. And those, yes, contain the space, but they also become a little bit more accessible. So you're not having to bend over, hurt your back, hurt your knees, etc. And then as far as the materials that will contain a planter, we looked at wood. You can certainly do it with stone. These are really beautiful planters. You can create something similar with CMU block. So typically we think of CMU block as just being, flat and ordinary. CMU standing for concrete masonry units. And they actually do come in different colors and sort of different finishes to them so that you can create a planter that perhaps looks a little bit more interesting. Now, if you want to get really fancy and you're willing to spend a little bit more money, you can create a planter with poured in place concrete. So this obviously gives you a lot of options when it comes to forming and shaping, and all of a sudden we're not limited to very linear shapes, but that is where we can start to get some curves and certainly have a bit more fun with what is possible. And then, of course, you've got prefabricated containers. So they come in different materials. They come in a terracotta, they come in glaze, they come in concrete. So lots of different options, different shapes, different colors. And then the possibility that you could actually look at your planters as artwork. So it moves from being a simple container to an element in and of itself. And then when you have a planter that is a piece of art, what are the plants that you would bring into it so that you can actually highlight both elements? And then this one is really wild, the possibility of using a planter as a table. So really the sky is the limit when it comes to what is possible for planting a garden in a smaller space. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with that first question, which is why planters to begin with? So sometimes it's compaction, which can be remediated with compost and sheet mulching. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult where you've got hardpan or caliche, where it's almost as though you've got a layer of what feels like concrete And you're literally going down with a shovel or a pick in order to get past that to hopefully a soil that's going to be a little bit easier to work with, but not always. Now, another issue that we can have with our soils, and this is actually a really big deal when it comes to edibles, is that there can be pollutants in the soil. So this may come from, potentially there's a freeway nearby or there's industry nearby. So you've got heavy metals that are in the air. Sometimes it comes from construction. And maybe, when they finished painting, they cleaned out their paint bucket and they splashed it out into the garden. But the point is that you have pollutants in the soil that will stunt, if not kill, the plants that you are trying to grow in there. So that may be a reason. In some cases, the issue is high salinity. So we have too many salts in our soils and our plants are not able to grow successfully. So sometimes that happens because literally you are near an ocean. It happens a lot in arid and semi-arid regions. And the reason being that because we don't get that kind of rain on a regular basis, we're not actually able to leach the salts out of the soil, out of the root zone. And then in many cases, we're actually getting an increase in our salinity because of our irrigation systems. So sometimes they will treat the water so that it doesn't corrode the pipes. And as a result, we are getting high salinity in our soils. And then this one can happen, and that is basically that your weeds have gone absolutely crazy. Weeds show up when the soil is in distress. There's this wonderful book that actually explains when you see different kinds of weeds, what's actually happening in the garden. So whether it's compaction or it's low in calcium or some other reason, there are weeds, we call them forbs now, that will actually show up in order to heal the soil. So typically when you have a situation like this, your soil is actually in pretty bad shape. But if you are unable to get that under control so that you can grow plants directly in the soil, it might be that you need to come up with a different option. And then another possibility is depending on your topography. So if you've got slopes or hillsides, it may be that you are going to want to do a little bit of containing so that you don't have, your soil at a slant, but rather that you can get a level surface to work with. Now, the great thing about containers is how flexible they can be. So it's possible, whether out of need or out of desire, that you want to create a container that is a little bit more accessible. Maybe you don't want to have to bend down so much. Maybe you want to be able to slide right into a planter. So again, that it's easy to reach. And even for younger people, the fact that they can just stand up, for our young kids, that they can just stand up and work at those planters directly. Now, a big reason that people will turn to planters or containers is because of limited space. So this is a before picture, and this is an after. And there's a couple of different examples of planters and containers. So the container is obvious with the pot sitting there on the hardscape, but what they've done is they've also created a series of raised beds. And so all of a sudden we went from a relatively boring surface to something that has a lot more interest to it. And they've done that by creating those raised planters. And then in some cases, you have really, really limited space, in which case, for some people, they don't even have a yard to speak of. They really have a patio where it's been, fully covered with concrete. And so there is the option to bring in fun, interesting, different heights of planters and containers to bring that green back into your garden. And then I love this possibility. So yes, you are definitely putting plants in the ground, but then you are integrating your planters or your containers. And what this does for me is it brings into the landscape that beautiful contrast of hard and soft. So the containers are in hard. You can play with different colors, with different textures. And then obviously you have the softness of the plantings. The other thing that a container will do is it will give you height, in that you are now planting, 12, 18, 24 inches above ground with, plants that are potentially eye-catching. And then there's the whole conversation about what do planters and containers add to the aesthetics or to the design choices. So again, we could have had something really, really ordinary happening here. This is also the case where there might have been an existing tree. And so they wanted to be able to maintain that tree and integrate it into the garden. And so they actually created a planter around it. So speaking of containment, again, the opportunity to create something that is of greater interest. Not to say that this tree planted in the ground would not be incredibly inviting and beautiful, but they added another dimension. They added another level to this design choice. The other benefit was that in creating that planter, that border, they actually made it wide enough so that you could sit on it. So the idea that as we are looking at these designs, that we think beyond the obvious, which is, I want to plant in a container, but what else is possible as we start arranging these in our landscapes? They are also wonderful at creating borders and boundaries. Again, whether you do that with planters or with containers or that combination of soft and hard, it creates the sense of a room, of a perimeter. And they're great for being able to accomplish that. And the thing about them is they can really go anywhere. So we've looked at some examples, but especially for those that have that limited space where there's no room or little room to actually put plants in the ground, that invitation to be able to bring in maybe an edible garden, maybe a native garden. You can put them on balconies, you can put them on decks, you can put them on rooftops. Whenever you are putting them on a space that is raised, though, you want to be aware of a couple of things. One is that soil with plants in it and water in it is going to get heavy. So if you are looking at a rooftop garden, which can be a whole lot of fun, you definitely need to be aware of, is there a load you need to be thinking about? And I realize this may be a little bit more than you were anticipating, but a few pots is no big deal. But if you're starting to bring in some significant weight, then something to think about. The other thing is you water that pot, that water is going to drain out of the pot. Where is it going? You don't want a bunch of standing water, certainly not on a rooftop area. So lots and lots of things are possible, and make sure that you look at it in its greater context. All right, soil. If you are working with plants or you want a garden, you cannot help but have a conversation about soil and how important it is. So if you have the ability to put a planter right into native soil, and that's, potentially using a wood barrier or a stone barrier, but you are tapping into that native soil, we want to remember how important it is to grow the soil sponge. So especially in a situation where maybe you're removing turf, or in most gardens, if you haven't been composting and you haven't been mulching, your soil is compacted and pretty depleted when it comes to nutrients. So it's really all about creating an opportunity for a soil sponge. So again, we do that with compost, we do that with sheet mulching, where we grow the biology in the soil, and we actually, with that biology, change the quality of the soil so it can hold on to water for much longer periods of time, and then slowly release that water to the plants as they need it. Along with that is encouraging the root growth of our plants. So, tomato roots can go down incredibly deep if they have room to do that. So again, with our compacted, depleted soils, where the roots go is pretty limited, maybe 3-4 inches. Where the roots are is where the water is, and it's where the biology is. And where the biology is where the food is, the nutrients for the plants. So what we want is that image on the right-hand side, right, where those roots can grow deep. The soil is free draining. And again, it's the idea that, the water reservoir is 3 inches deep or the water reservoir is 2 feet deep. This changes how frequently you're going to irrigate, and obviously how resilient your plant will be able to become. And the way we do this is not by feeding the plant. So we've been taught that, perhaps we're buying fertilizers and we're spraying it on the plant and the fertilizer is feeding the plant. but that's not actually how it works. What we want to do is feed the soil. And this applies to native soil as well as soil that you're potentially bringing in, from a store or another source. So we want to be bringing compost in, which can be mixed into the soil. It looks like soil. It smells like soil. It smells delicious. And it is in a form that is small enough, fine enough for the biology to be able to use it to grow and then to go ahead and provide nutrients for our plants. Mulch has other benefits. So mulch is fantastic for keeping our plants cool, for keeping the soil moist. And as it breaks down, it will also start to feed the soil. So mulch, much bigger pieces, we're looking at maybe an inch and a half, not big pieces. And you're putting mulch on top. So compost you can put on top and you can mix it in. Mulch we just want to put on top. And then we need oxygen. So we don't typically think about needing to get oxygen into the soil. We think about it certainly when it comes to what we breathe, but we actually do need to get oxygen into the soil as well. And it may be, depending how compacted your soil is, that you're going to have to break it up a little bit. If we do that, we do it one time because it is all about really growing that soil biology underground. And then once we have it, sort of started, we want to leave it alone. So as far as bringing in non-native soils, it's going to depend on how large your container is. So if you've got a few, pots that you're going to fill, you can absolutely bring it in with a bag. You are looking for potting mix or potting soil. Always check the source of the material. Obviously, you want it organic. The idea that the healthier the soil is, the healthier your plants will be. But if you're looking at doing a big planter or you're filling some big pots, you may want to bring it in by bulk. So the thing about planting mix versus a native soil is that, when we looked at that image before, when we looked at this image, you could see the materials that it's made of. So it doesn't have native soil in it. You've got things like peat moss and vermiculite and perlite. These make the soil very, very light, which makes it easy when you're trying to transport it right from one place to another. But the downside of this is because it is lighter and it's fluffier, it's also going to drain much faster and it's going to dry out faster. And in some cases, and I've had it happen to me, I've opened up a bag of planting mix, I planted a few plants, and then I've stopped. And then maybe, 3 weeks later, I've come back wanting to do another plant. And that planting mix has gotten so dried out that it's actually not holding onto the water. So if that's the case for you, you want to make sure that that planting mix gets thoroughly wetted. Like you might even want to put it like in a bucket of water, get it thoroughly wetted before you actually put it into a pot. So that's a little bit of the downside of that potting mix. The other issue that you might have with planting mix is that there can be some major subsidence, which basically means that you put it in and then over time it's going to settle. And what started out with a full pot is now half a pot of soil. So what we would recommend is actually put in more than you think, pat it down, add water. After you plant, again, add water, pat it down, and make sure that at least where you are starting is where you want to be. It's still going to drop down over time, but at least it's not a week into your planting. Other things that you can absolutely do to a potting soil is you can add compost to it, you can add worm castings to it, and you can mulch. So again, the mulch, whether it's in the ground, or in a planter or in a pot, has all of those additional benefits. The big one is that it's going to keep that soil moist for a longer period of time, and that eventually it will break down. All right, let us talk about water and drainage. So the number one thing that will kill a plant is you are either underwatering it or you are overwatering it. And again, this question about oxygen is that we certainly know what happens to a plant when we don't have enough water. When there's not enough water, there's potentially a lot of oxygen. Our plant gets wilty and then it eventually can die. But it's also possible to overwater. And what that means is that you have so much water in those gaps that you don't have enough oxygen. And when there's not enough oxygen, you actually create an environment for anaerobic life. So anaerobic life is where we start to get our pathogens and our disease. And so what we're looking for is that sweet spot, right? Where you've got just enough water and you've got just enough oxygen that we are really stimulating the life of the soil party. And as a result, your plants do really well. And as far as different ways to water, you can certainly hand water. If you have pots or if you have raised beds, to go out there, whether it's early in the morning with the birds singing or late in the afternoon after a long day's work, to just go out. It's a lovely form of meditation, of just sort of quieting the day down and connecting. There's also this other thing called oyas. And the way they work is they are made of terracotta. You can buy them, but you could also make them. And the thing about the terracotta is that the water will actually wick through it. It will actually move through that material into the soil. And basically, the studies have shown, or the tests they've done, is the oyas will wick approximately 1 inch of water a day. But the thing about them that's so wonderful is you only have to fill them every so often instead of, coming out and watering every day or every other day. Then you can get these self-watering boxes, self-explanatory. There's a drawing in just a moment I'll show you. But basically what you're doing is you're putting water into a reservoir that sits at the bottom of where the plants are. And the same thing, that the plants will be able to wick that water up from below. So here is a drawing. You can absolutely build this yourself. The idea that there is a sealed container. You've got water down in the bottom. You're going to have a pipe that goes into it. You've got holes in that pipe so that it can make its way up to the soil. And then you've got different layers. You've got sand, and then you've got more soil and compost, and then you put in your plants. And the idea that you water maybe once or twice, and that the plants have regular access to water without that soil getting too wet. Now, if you have a larger area, if you're doing, edible gardens or, a lot of planters, you may want to consider installing drip irrigation. So drip irrigation is going to be a greater investment, both in terms of time and materials and money, but also gives you a lot of control. And again, this makes sense if you're doing larger or a series of large planters. So you've got your tubing that's going to sit on top. You are using tubing that is, the emitters are built in, so inline tubing. And then you want to space them apart so that when they're running, you're getting really even coverage, right? We don't want to have all the water in one part of the planter and it not getting water in the others. So here is a diagram that might be helpful. You can see we've got our bed. It's about 4 by 8 feet. You can see how the emitters are spaced relatively even apart. The other thing is that the emitters are offset. So if you line up all your emitters, in a row, you will get gaps in the soil where we're not getting the water. But by offsetting them, by doing that triangulation thing, then you are getting that really even coverage. So if you're doing drip, these are things to think about. So here is the emitter, dripping its water. These are some of the elements on that raised bed. This is the shutoff valve. So if you have multiple raised beds, it's possible that at certain times of the year, you're not going to be growing anything in that bed. Maybe it's not that time of the year, or the crop is much smaller, or for whatever reason. So by having one of these shutoff valves at each of the beds, it allows you to control the irrigation much more specifically. Now, when it comes to water and the soils, either in a native setting or with potting soil, this also is going to affect how much water is being held onto and how frequently you're going to have to irrigate or water. So we talked about how potting soil is much fluffier and it dries out faster. So pretty much the particles are larger, gaps are larger. So the water just moves through way faster than it does with our native soils. So that was comparing potting soil with native soil. When we're looking at native soils, there are also different types of soil. So you may have heard there's sandy soil, there's clay soil, there's loam soil. Most soils are some sort of combination of multiple different types. And they also have different capacities for holding on to water. So sand is at one end of the extreme, big particles, big gaps. Again, our water is running through pretty quickly. We like to use this analogy of coffee. We love our coffee at G3. So with sand, we've got iced coffee, right? If you were to pour that coffee into that glass with the ice cubes, it would go in super easily. If you were to drill a hole at the bottom, it would flow out super quickly. Clay, our particles are fine. This is a little bit more like a blended coffee, where if you were to put it in, it would take a little bit more effort, a little bit more work in order to fill that glass. If I were a plant and I were trying to sip it up, it would be more difficult. And if I were to put a hole at the bottom of this blended coffee, it would definitely take a lot longer for it to move through. So the idea being that similar to potting soil versus native soil, there are also differences between sandy soil versus clay soil. And a question that we get, and obviously this is going to depend on where you live in terms of how much watering you need to do, but the ratios are probably pretty accurate. So if we start out with a native soil in the ground, high ET refers to how much water a plant needs. At this point, we're talking about edibles. So especially edibles that are annual types typically need a bit more water than, say, other types of plants. In the wintertime, where you can plant, we're looking at maybe 40 minutes a week. This is via drip, not spray. In the summertime, we're pretty much doubling that amount of water, so anywhere between 80 to 120 minutes per week. Then we go to working with planters that have potting mix in them. So again, high ET edibles, still watering with drip. In the winter, we're up to 80 minutes per week. And in the summer, we're looking at anywhere between 160 and 240 minutes per week. So you can see that that is a significant difference in the amount of water that you will need to apply in order to get your plants growing. Now, as we have talked about, if you have too much water or that water is not draining, and whether that's in the pot or in the soil itself, if you have water and not enough oxygen, you are going to kill your plants. And it's tricky because you look at this plant and it's easy to assume that it didn't get enough water. So that is the big problem, is we look at something like this and we assume it doesn't have enough water and we add more water, which makes the situation worse. So as you are looking at your materials, your containers, whether it's a pot or you're building it or you're taking a whiskey barrel and you're converting it, make sure that there is drainage, that there is a place for that water to drain out of the container. Got some examples here. Again, they took a crate and they drilled it. That's a Corten steel box up at the top. You can see how they have weep holes, that's what we call them, or drainage holes where that water can leave the container. And if you're building your own, what you want to do is you don't want to put you can just put holes at the bottom of it. You definitely need to put something on that hole. I used to use stockings or old socks so that the water can still drain through it, but the soil doesn't have to. So if you are building a larger one, you can put those weep holes down at the bottom. You're going to go ahead and put down something called geotextile cloth. So this isn't weed cloth. It is something designed specifically for this purpose. So you're going to put one layer right over the holes. Then you can put in some gravel. So the gravel is, again, larger particles, bigger gaps. So once the water hits that level, it's going to drain much more quickly. And then you go ahead and put another layer of the geotextile cloth down, because then you're going to go ahead and put your soil in. And we would just as soon keep those two types of material separate. So the geotextile cloth helps with that. So one of the issues with having containers or planters on hardscape is the potential for water stains. Not an issue, obviously, if they are out in the garden itself, but when they are sitting on hardscape, whether it's concrete or flagstone, and that water starts making its way through, you certainly have potential of the water staining. But a lot of times what you'll see is that as the water makes its way through the soil, it's actually leaching some of the color from that as well. So you will get, rust stains, or you'll get brown spots, which is, not so fun. So some of the things that you can do is you can actually elevate your planters. So this is great in terms of making them a little bit more accessible, but then they're not sitting right on the ground. And then you can put, little trays underneath to catch it, or hosed it down so that that water isn't standing in one place, staining the surfaces. Similar, you can add feet to the bottom of your pot. Again, so that you can access it, whether it's that you can get a tray underneath, or simply that you can hose it off so that you don't have stained water sitting in one location for an extended period of time. Now, for my do-it-yourselfers, what would be involved in actually building your own planter? So these are raised beds. You can make it as high as you want. A lot of these are built for edible gardens or herb gardens, or maybe starting seedlings, but basically creating a space that is more protected and enclosed. The sort of ideal space is about 4 by 8 feet. You can go smaller, but you don't really want to go larger. The reason being that you want to be able to access these planters from all around. So you want to be able to lean over and at least get to the middle without too much strain. You don't want to have to walk a mile to be able to come around to the other side of it. So 4 by 8 is kind of a nice dimension for these. 12 to 18 inches high, and clean wood. So what I mean by clean wood is you don't want to bring in wood. And again, this is very important for edibles, but even for ornamentals. You don't want to use wood that's been treated or painted, at least not on the inside, because anything that is on the inside is potentially going to leach into the soil. And then as it does that, all of a sudden you are potentially affecting the health of your plants. Now, in some cases, if you have wood, maybe you've done some construction and you've got all of this extra wood that has been painted or has been treated, you can build a planter with it. But what you're going to do is you're going to add a protective layer. So this is a pond liner. You can absolutely use one of these. And then what it does is it basically protects the soil from whatever that wood has been treated with. Now, in some cases, the issue with why we're not planting in the ground is because of critters. In this case, the little gopher. Unfortunately, chicken wire doesn't really keep them out. But again, especially if you're growing edibles, they're kind of notorious for eating everything. So if there are plants that you really want to protect, then you're going to go ahead and put in this wire mesh. And then build that planter up high enough so that you can create a significant barrier to the guys coming from underneath. If one of the issues you were having was weeds, then you're going to go ahead and cut that back as far as possible. And then beneath the planter, you'll go ahead and put layers of cardboard. The great thing about the cardboard is that eventually it does biodegrade. There's no dangerous chemicals we need to worry about. And over time, the weeds that were underneath the planter should get smothered, and then you can go ahead, let that cardboard dissolve, and then eventually the plants you've put on top will make their way down into the deeper soil. Now, it's quite possible that snails are your critter of choice or not choice. Something that's actually super easy to do is you can get copper tape. And then basically because their bodies are so wet, they get a zing when they touch copper. And so you just put this copper around the edge, the perimeter there, and it keeps them out of your beds. Now, something else you may want to consider is adding mobility. As these planters, and that planter in the larger image there, that's a pretty significant size. And once you put soil in there and your plants start to grow and you're watering, it's going to get a little bit heavy. Or it may be that as we move into colder weather, you want to be able to bring those pots indoors. So if that is the case, the possibility you can either buy something that already has wheels attached, or you can add wheels, or you can create, sort of this rolling stand that you put your pots on top of. So that's a really good thing to consider as you are planning your garden or you're designing your garden is some of those pots, just the pots themselves, if they're made of concrete or clay, can be extremely heavy even before you put in the soil and the water. So just keeping that in mind, will I ever need to move my pot? And if so, how do I accomplish that? All right, puzzle piece number 5, just exciting you and inspiring you with some options. So this is a planter that was custom built. It was made of redwood. So the great thing about redwood is it is a very long-lived wood to work with. It takes a long time for this wood to break down. As it was designed, they created, small seating areas so that you could go ahead and work with those edibles. They added trellises, again, with a very deliberate design. So this was designed. And then they actually have a combination of the planter, and then there is native soil below it and around it. And so at the base of it, they added wild strawberries. So this idea that it's not just a planter floating out in the middle of a bunch of hardscape, but that it feels connected to that patio, to that context. This is another material that you can work with, and that is Trex. So the thing about Trex is it is great as the side paneling. You will want to use the wood for the integrity of the planter. But they are great. They're made of composite materials. They do not break down. They're not toxic, so you can plant right in them. And they come in a few different colors. This is that super, super simple planter we were talking about. They didn't even go up 12 inches. This one is 6 inches. They barely worried about the structure. They used corner braces to keep it in place. It's maybe 6 to 8 inches. They used pine, which is one of the least expensive woods that you can build with. The downside of pine is that it's not going to last very long. So maybe 3-4 years, if that, before that wood is going to start to break down. But, if it's for, just a quick and dirty planting area, you can rebuild them again in a few years if you need to. But the amount of expense, materials, expertise is pretty minimal with a planter like this. Now, in some cases, the critters that are eating your vegetables are deer or moose. And so you may need to be a little bit more vigorous in your protection. In this case, there is a screen that goes over the entire thing. You can see that they brought the screens down in order to access the vegetables, but then when they're done, they'll go ahead and put those screens back in place. And then here is kind of an interesting way of looking at your front yard. So, perhaps you've got turf and you've got some trees and you've got some perennials, but what about having the entrance to your home be a series of planters? And there's lots of opportunity. In this case, it's exclusively planters, but they could certainly have designed this one where you had planters and you also had plants going directly into the ground. And then again, this is a different design shape, showing you lots of possibilities. Up to this point, we've seen the slats go laterally or horizontally. In this case, they changed it up a little bit by having the slots going vertically. So it changes the look of this planter. And then they added iron trellises. So the idea of being able to mix and match the materials instead of everything being all wood, you've got wood now and iron. And then, of course, our plants. Now, when we start moving into some of these other materials, it's going to take a little bit more expertise, a little bit more of a budget, unless this is already on the premises. This is a planter area made with stacked stone. It's possible there's some mortar in there to keep it in place. It is possible they can be designed so that they are built just with that material alone. There is no mortar holding things together. And then here we have an example of that poured in place. So this is such a clean look. It's quite possible that the house is very modern in its aesthetics. It's got succulents in it, which are very architectural. So there's a very distinct essence to this garden. If you are looking at poured in place anything, make sure that you think about water. If you're irrigating it, how are you getting water into the planter? As it's being watered, how is that water draining out? So that is a big consideration whenever you have built-in planters. And then this last idea isn't so much about the planter, but something you might want to consider depending on where you live, and climate is just getting more and more crazy. That it might be, especially in the beginning as your plants are just getting established, or maybe you're starting with seedlings or little 4-inch pots, that midday is going to be intense for them. So the possibility that you can just put down some shade cloth. So again, this is a very fancy setup. You don't need to do anything that significant except, for example, if you've got a small little plant, maybe you just put up a tomato cage and then you just drape something, a lightweight fabric, so that, in that noon to 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, your plants are a little bit more protected. So we've talked about CMU blocks in terms of stacking them in order to build a planter. But this, she literally just stacked them one on top of the other. This is completely, you can take this down in a matter of minutes. And then she filled the center with soil. It doesn't get easier than this. It doesn't take a lot of strength, doesn't take a lot of money. CMU blocks are super cheap. It doesn't take a lot of expertise, and she has, voila, a planter. If you have an area where concrete has been broken up, say you had a driveway or you had a concrete patio that you wanted to take apart, you can repurpose that concrete similar to what you would have done with stacked stone to create planters there as well. Here we start getting a little bit fancier. This one was actually created by G3's founder, Pamela Bursler, and it is a planter to lie on that is actually real turf. It's not artificial turf, real turf. And then right behind it, she has some tangerines or kumquats that are growing in a smaller planter. So we start getting a little bit more eccentric at this point. This was a planter where we cut the bottom out of it. It is sitting on top of native soil. And this is a tree that actually reaches all the way up to the next level. And what they've done is they've created the opportunity for those roots as they grow down to actually keep going down into the native soil. So that is a problem, certainly when you're doing trees or even shrubs into a container, is that eventually those roots are going to get so large that they don't really fit in the container very well. At the end, we talk about plants that do better in containers, but this was a situation where they actually planned for that and how to make that possible. Now, as we move into containers, it just opens up. So you've certainly got glazed containers. It's been fired and then glazed with all kinds of amazing colors. Corten steel. So this also has a very specific aesthetic to it. It's a very cool material. One of the things to think about is that they get hot. It's metal. And so depending on where you're using them, if you're using it in the shade, not a big deal. But if it is out in the sun, you are going to want to line it with something that will protect the roots of your plant. And then the terracotta. So we see these everywhere. They come from all different parts of the world. Some of them are very simple. Some of them are much more ornate. Whenever we're using containers, the bigger the better, right, for our roots to grow. The thing with the terracotta, we saw it with the Oyas, is the moisture will wick through it. So you are watering more frequently in a terracotta pot than you are in a glazed one. The way that you can offset that is by sealing it, some sort of seal that you can put on the inside. You can even use like concrete seal. And then that way that water is not leaving the pot as quickly. And then the way that you can play with containers. There is so much fun to be had with them. So in this case, these are all edibles. We've got oregano and we've got basil and we've got rosemary. The pots are all the same, or essentially the same, but they have played with different rhythms and different patterns. Here, it's all the same pot. They've got different colored tulips in there, but they made an entire wall of containers. So they completely changed the aesthetic of what was potentially a plain, ordinary fence. And the thing about planters is you just need a container. So really the idea that just about anything can work. Things to think about when you move beyond the ordinary container is how is it going to drain? And especially again, if you are working with edibles, what is inside? Do you need to plan for some kind of liner or protection from whatever that container is lined with or sealed with or made of to what is going into the soil and then the plants? And now our last piece of the puzzle, and that is the plants. So not all plants like being in containers. Even in the garden, if you think of ficus, they don't even like being in, a planting bed. Their roots go out, they tear up sidewalk, they tear up foundations, but they're not the only ones. As you are thinking about what it is that you are planting, here's some things to think about. So if you're doing an edible garden, there are some vegetables that are much happier with a deeper container. So that includes tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, peppers. There's probably others. So as you are looking for your favorite vegetable or fruit that you're planting, and it's going into a container, consider what is its root system like. Because you're going to get others like lettuces, radishes, spinach, and onions that can do just fine with very short containers. So this is bok choy here. And then, of course, herbs. Now, we teach a class on herbs, and there are actually lots of different herbs that grow in all different shapes and sizes. But for sort of the standard herbs, maybe our Mediterranean herbs, you could do something like this, an herb pot, where you have different herbs in each of those pockets. Succulents are fantastic in pots. Their architecture is pretty stunning. They don't grow crazy quick. Their root system is not terribly aggressive. They don't need as much water as some of our other plants, and you can mix and match them in all kinds of really fun ways. In some cases, if you are working with succulents, then it might be a good idea to actually get a cactus mix. So a cactus mix is going to be a soil that drains faster than, for example, a native mix, and is configured differently than even a potting mix. And then finally, when it comes to other plants that you're going to be putting into the landscape, I just read about this philosophy that's called thrillers, fillers, and spillers. That's why I loved the way that that all sounded. So the thrillers obviously are the big dramatic plants, whether it's their architecture or it's their color or it's their shape. When you look at a series of container plants, it's going to stand out. So this is the New Zealand flax. It does really, really well in containers as well. Citrus trees. Obviously, you want to get the dwarf varieties. They have some where they've grafted different types of citrus. So you can get an orange, you can get a kumquat, you can get a tangerine, all in the same tree. Obviously, with a citrus tree, the bigger the pot, the better. Other thrillers are roses. There are spectacular varieties of roses that are out there. There may be a situation where you've got a balcony or you've got a patio and you would love to have roses, but there's no soil to put it in, no garden to put it in. Bring in a big container and plant your favorites. Another one, I love this one, is the Japanese maple. So other thrillers include an African boxwood. So the boxwood doesn't have a lot of flowers, but it has just a really neat form. And sometimes that's nice to do, is to have what we would call foundation plants, even with containers. So the idea that you have something that holds its structure and its color all year round. So the boxwood is an evergreen. And then you can have, you know, the splashes of color with the other ones, with the fillers and the spillers. So rhododendron azaleas are also wonderful. Any kind of pittosporum, again, has that sort of foundation element to it. Plus, when they do bloom, they smell absolutely amazing. All right, so now we move to fillers. Fillers are those mid-level plants. So you've got your thriller, and then you put your fillers potentially at the base of it. I am actually a big proponent of putting one plant in each pot because those plants grow, those roots grow. So better to do that, that arranging with plants in individual pots rather than cramming it all into one pot. So examples of some of our fillers include the heuchera, the coral bells, which come in all different kinds of colors. Lavender is a great filler or a thriller, depending on how you use it. Again, we've talked about succulents, and then coreopsis comes in different kinds, different accents to it, and ferns. If you live in an area or your house is located so that you have a little bit more shade or that the sun is a morning sun, then play with ferns because those are so luscious in a container garden. And then spillers. So these are the ones that spill over. There are some great, again, you could go, you know, into your local nursery or, you know, just do some research, especially with the smaller ones, the fillers and the spillers. There's less of a concern about them outgrowing their pot or, you know, cracking a pot. But some of the great ones include that snow in summer, which has a little bit of a gray color to its leaves, lantana. The trailing lantana is fantastic. That Lysimachia, the creeping Jenny, and then, yeah, lots and lots of different ways. So the pot you're looking at actually has bulbs in it and the spiller and the filler. This is a container that they are refurbishing every so often. So once the tulips are done, then, you know, potentially they're bringing in other bulbs as well. So that is a possibility that you can also have containers that have more long-lived plants, your perennials, your woody plants, and then you've got a few smaller ones that you fill with your annuals. So your impatiens or your begonias, where they're going to be like just this burst of color for a relatively short period of time, and then you're going to go ahead and change them out. And then again, the different ways that you can play with contrast. In this case, it is the contrast of the plant and the pot. Sometimes you're playing with the contrast of the plants within each other. In this example here, you know, you've got this deep dark purple and then this sort of gray green, and the contrast of that is spectacular. But you can also mix things like texture and shape of the leaves and what's high and what's low. It is very much a subjective thing. So you may like, you know, all the same pots, relatively simple plantings. Other people are going to want to really mix it up with bright colors and lots of blossoms. So the great thing about container plantings is it's not a huge investment. Once you have your pot, you know, if you don't like it, you just take out the plant and put in something else and play, and you can move them around, right? It's not like putting a tree in your backyard. It's not going anywhere. And so that is really the invitation with containers, with planters, is that you can really customize your own experience. I love this image. I sort of stumbled upon it. It's almost like you can't tell what is the art and what is the plants. And I think that is that beautiful blend of when our plants become the art becomes the plants. And with that, you create a really beautiful experience for yourself, for friends and family, as well as for the other critters that will come to visit. So with that, I say thank you so much for having joined me today on this topic, containers and planters. I hope you will go out and experiment and have fun, and perhaps join us again for another webinar. Have a great day and happy gardening.